Hello, we're just going to get started. Can I just take this moment to ask you if you've got your mobile phone on to switch it to silent or off, please? Hello, a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Elaine from Word Power Books, Scotland's independent and radical bookshop, and it's a great pleasure for us to be hosting this event with great kindness to the School of Social and Political Science, who've kindly given us the space. And it's great that we have George Monbiot here to launch his latest book. George is a big fan of independent bookshops, we know, and in the course of organising this event, I've had quite a lot of new people in the shop, many of you who've never been in Word Power before. So obviously I couldn't miss an opportunity with 500 people here to let you know Word Power Books is a great independent bookshop. We do lots of free events like this, and I do, just bear with me a minute, those of you who were super keen and got quick off the mark to get tickets, some of you may have paid £2, and I do apologise for that, and you are entitled to a refund. There was a little mix-up at the beginning, but the event, of course, is free like all the events we do. So if you would like your £2 back, you can come to the bookstall at the end and get it. You may feel like you'd like to give it as a donation. And to everyone else who hasn't paid their £2, if everybody gave £2 or more, a little silent donation of a little blue bit of paper wafting in, that would help us cover all the costs for organising the event and put on other great events like this. I know George was just at iWrite in Glasgow yesterday. I think the tickets were £10 there. So, you know, £2 wouldn't be bad, would it? No. So George's books are downstairs. This is the new one, but we also have some of his backlist, and he will be signing downstairs at the end of the event. So if you've not been quick off the mark and got your book before the event, you might have a wee queue, but you'd be welcome to come and buy a book then. And it would be lovely to see you in Word Power Books at some point. We're just across from the Pear Tree Pub. But I'm going to hand over now to Fiona Mackay, who is head of the School of Social and Political Science, who's going to introduce George this evening. So thank you all for coming.
So thank you, Elaine. Can everybody hear me? Is my mic switched on? Yeah, grand. So, as Elaine said, I'm Fiona Mackay. I'm head of the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm very, very pleased indeed to welcome you to this event organised by Independent Bookshop and Local Heroes, Word Power, and co-hosted by the university. Before I move on to the main business of the evening, I have a couple of housekeeping matters. So the first one is, not wanting to contradict Elaine, put your phones on silent but don't switch them off, and please do tweet. And the hashtag is #ThisMess. Okay. And the second bit of housekeeping is that there is no fire drill planned. So if the alarms go off, it's real. So please, in an orderly manner, evacuate the building using both side doors and following the green signs. Okay, thank you very much. So my main task this evening is a very easy one. So it's to introduce somebody who really does need little by way of introduction. George Monbiot, the social critic, media columnist and writer, and the economic and environmental commentator and activist. George started his career as a broadcaster, making natural history and environment programmes, later working as an investigative reporter. According to Wikipedia, which of course I tell my students never to actually consult and would take marks off, his activities have led him to being made persona non grata in at least 7 countries. He has been involved in many of the major grassroots campaigns of the last 20 years, around including direct action, around social, environmental and economic justice, politics and climate change. So he is a veritable thorn in the side of the establishment. George Monbiot is one of the most vocal and one of the most eloquent of critics of current orthodoxies around politics, the neoliberal global order, the global financial crisis, and the state of the environment. He's the author of numerous books, including The Age of Consent in 2003, A Manifesto for a New World Order, and the award-winning recent book, Feral, Searching for Enchantment on the Frontiers of Rewilding. His latest book, How Did We Get Into This Mess?, assesses the state we are now in. The devastation of the natural world, the crisis of inequality, the corporate takeover of nature, our seeming obsessions with growth and profit at all costs, and what he argues is a decline of political debate about causes, consequences, and potential strategies for change. Urgent, direct, provocative, persuasive, combative, annoying, impassioned are just some of the adjectives applied to Monbiot and his work. Writing about himself, Monbiot describes his life as a slightly unhinged adventure. I have no idea where it will take me. So far, it has been gripping. I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that tonight, this evening promises to be nothing less than gripping also. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming George Monbiot.
Well, thank you, Fiona, and thank you very much, Elaine. You can see why word power continues to prosper in a hostile environment. With Elaine there, it can hardly fail to do so. Now, it's as if the people of the Soviet Union had never heard of communism. The defining feature of our economic and political lives, the ideology which affects almost every aspect of our existence, which causes crises of many dimensions, everything from the financial crisis to the epidemic of loneliness to the rise of Donald Trump, for most people is nameless. It is an astonishing thing. If you go into a pub or into almost any social forum and start talking about neoliberalism, most people won't have the faintest idea what you are on about. And you're obviously a highly enlightened audience, I can tell because you've come to hear me. How many of you would feel confident in defining it? It's an astonishing thing, isn't it? This is the doctrine which governs our governments. This is the doctrine which governs just about everything that takes place in our social relations and our political relations, not to mention our economic relations, but we don't even know what it is. And in that is, for that doctrine, a tremendous source of power. Its anonymity is both a reflection of power, a sort of tacit consensus right across the media, right across the political class, not to talk about it, not to identify it, but it is also a source of power. It is empowered by the fact that we don't even know what it is. We don't even know, in many cases, that it is. And it's this which I think lies at the heart both of our inability to grapple, to even to grasp the scale of the problem that we confront, and our inability, because we don't realize that we're facing a coherent and deliberate system, to see that the only possible means of confronting it is a coherent and deliberate system of our own. So, let me give you my half-baked definition of neoliberalism, or rather, let me start by taking us back to where it came from, how it arose, and then gradually explain what it is. The term was first developed in 1938 at a colloquium in Paris. And it was a gathering of people who were obviously very concerned about political developments across Europe. And they saw the rise of totalitarianism, particularly Nazism, but also communism, eroding many of the basic freedoms that they valued. In particular, they saw these totalitarian regimes as crushing the individual spirit, the freedom of the individual. And they also, the innovation they introduced was to suggest that the social democratic nations, places like Britain and the US, for instance, which at the time had politics which could be clearly classified as social democratic, the New Deal in the US, for instance, the beginnings of the welfare state which had been brought in by Asquith and Lloyd George, and of course would later, during and after the war, be consolidated. They saw those social democratic trends as also leading to totalitarianism and the crushing of the individual. I mean, they had a sort of slightly hysterical approach to this, but the leading neoliberals were all, as it happens, Austrian exiles, and the Austrian experience, of course, at the time was a very grim one indeed. So they could be forgiven for a little bit of exaggeration and hyperbole in terms of their sort of clumping and aggregation of what seemed to me to be clearly unrelated political trends. And to begin with, it was a fairly mild doctrine, but gradually it began to consolidate, and particularly through the work of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. And they formulated this doctrine that the only way in which human beings could really be free was through operating through the market. Through buying and selling, through selling their own services, their own labour, through buying the products of other people's labour, and that, they believed, was a more democratic and a freer means of engagement than having a dirigiste government saying this is the way things are going to be. They believed that planning of any kind was fundamentally flawed because people didn't have sufficient information to be able to plan rationally and well. And so to begin with, they produced a kind of middle way between social democracy and the laissez-faire economics of the 19th century, which allowed so many people to fall into utter destitution and squalor while the rich prospered. They thought there was a middle way between those positions. But gradually, as time went on, and particularly as the focus shifted to the United States, to the University of Chicago, Richmond, Virginia, and it was picked up by economists over there, such as Milton Friedman, and massively backed by corporate money, which was absolutely critical. These very big corporate tycoons saw in the doctrine a tremendous opportunity for empowerment. It hardened up. And it became a far shriller and less nuanced doctrine, which basically said the market will answer all our cures. The market is this wonderful, distributive, neutral force which allows the best to triumph. It allows quality to be identified, and we can leave everything to that. The state's role should be confined to the rule of law, to security, to basically making sure that the products of your labour are not robbed from you, but that's just about it. And even things such as education can be supplied better by the market than they can be supplied by government. And at first, people thought they were utterly bonkers. They were a tiny fringe movement in terms of numbers, though they did have an awful lot of money behind them. Because what the corporations saw very clearly, and the leaders of the corporations, was that this thing called the market, this wonderful, anonymous, amorphous, invisible hand thing out there called the market, which doesn't really conjure up any pictures in the head except perhaps a street market where is a sort of, there's parity in a street market, you and the trader aren't in very different economic positions, hides far more than it elucidates. It hides the identity of the players within the market, who are, of course, the dominant players, the corporations, the billionaires, the plutocrats. And it suggests that there's no agency taking place. It's just this assortative thing which automatically decides who deserves to succeed and who deserves to fail. Whereas in reality, as we know, these processes are driven very hard by power relations exerted between the rich and the poor, in effect. And moreover, it was the first doctrine certainly of the middle 20th century, overtly and explicitly to say inequality is good. And the claim it made was that the rising tide lifts all boats, and so it doesn't really matter who gets rich, because everybody will get rich if some people get rich. And that the more people are allowed to succeed, the more money there will be for everybody, and so we should just stand back and not try to intervene. Now, of course, what the plutocrats also knew was that that race is fine. That race of the idea of equality of opportunity but not equality of outcome, when you are already 3/4 of the way down the track and other people have to start at the beginning. Because, of course, what neoliberalism had nothing to say about was stuff like inheritance and private education and all the other massive advantages which the children of plutocrats have, which means that equality of opportunity under those circumstances is a dead letter. And so you have this situation which is an almost perfect formula for the transfer of wealth and power from the poor to the rich. Because the neoliberals say cut taxes. Now, of course, taxation, when it's progressive taxation, is the most powerful means of all of distributing money from the rich to the poor and providing the poor with the means to lead a good life. Through the purchase of public services with that taxpayers' money, of social security, of all the other things which are essential to free you from want and squalor and deprivation and ignorance and illiteracy and all the other ills which assailed the poor in the 19th century and are beginning to assail the poor once more. It also said business should be deregulated. And it turns out that the businesses which were most keen on the neoliberal agenda were those who'd been most fined most often for polluting rivers, for putting their workers through industrial machinery and killing them, for not paying the minimum wage in countries where the minimum wage applied and stuff. They hated all that. They asserted the human right to kill their workers, in effect, to poison the rivers, in effect. They saw that as a fundamental freedom, a fundamental right. And of course, the freedom of the pike, as Isaiah Berlin points out, is death to the minnow. But neoliberalism does not recognize that. Neoliberalism just says freedom. Freedom is good. We're not going to define this freedom, but freedom is good. Not freedom of information, obviously. They want us to know as little about them as we possibly can, like who funds them. All the neoliberal think tanks, like the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute of Economic Affairs, are absolutely silent about their funders. Which is convenient because it turns out, for instance, that the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is on the BBC just about every 10 minutes, talking about how plain packaging for cigarettes is a really bad idea and second-hand tobacco smoke isn't that bad after all, has been funded by Philip Morris, the giant tobacco company, since 1963, and is sent fact sheets by Philip Morris, which it then repeats on the radio. The BBC, of course, never asks it to reveal its funders, and even now that we know that it's been funded by them, never mentions its funders. But the anonymity of neoliberalism is not just the anonymity of the ideology, but also the anonymity of the people who stand behind it. The big business donors, like the Koch brothers, for instance, like the tobacco companies, like, above all, the fossil fuel companies. Because this is intimately connected, as you might imagine, with climate change denial, because climate change is the sort of thing which is absolute anathema to the neoliberal vision, because, as Lord Stern remarks, it represents the greatest market failure in human history. The market is supposed to be able to solve everything. But the market has helped to create climate change. So climate change can't be happening because it does not fit with the theory. So they massively fund climate change denial outfits to say that it's not happening. So fine, the theory's all right, it's safe, it's just fine. And while it began on the fringe, these people were extremely skilled at promoting the idea and gradually ensuring that it infiltrated into all sorts of forums, but particularly government. They created what has been described as a neoliberal international, a vast transatlantic network, primarily operating through think tanks and through academic faculties, faculties which were massively sponsored by the plutocrats to produce the results that they wanted. And individual academics and professors who were sponsored by those plutocrats, often tremendous amounts of money to produce the results that they wanted. And slowly these ideas migrated from the extreme margins into a more and more central position, first of all into the campaign of Barry Goldwater, then into the campaigns of Ronald Reagan, who very skillfully, with the help of various advisors, managed to fuse this market fundamentalism at the heart of neoliberalism with the Christian conservative agenda, with other forms of social conservatism, and with the very strong but generally subliminal current of racism that affects politics, particularly in the southern states, and turn this into a very potent new conservatism with neoliberalism, this market fetishization at the heart of it, but all those other elements mixed in. And when the crises of Keynesianism in the 1970s hit, with the problems such as stagflation, with problems of industrial action, which the governments didn't know how to engage with all sorts of economic and fiscal problems in the UK, government having to go to the IMF in 1976 with 26% inflation at one point, in the US 10% inflation, load of problems, massive problems, stagflationary problems basically, so stagnant growth but inflation at the same time, which the Keynesian fiscal stimulus, which had been used so effectively in the 40s, 50s and 60s, simply couldn't respond to and couldn't solve. The neoliberals were able to step up and say, here is a ready-made set of economic prescriptions, a ready-made political philosophy within which they're embedded, you can have this. And interestingly, actually, the first people to apply certain aspects of it in the form of monetarism, using control of the money supply rather than control of the public spending budget to try to deal with inflation, were Carter and the Callaghan government. So it was these sort of centre-left governments which first began to adopt elements of it, but then, of course, when Thatcher and Reagan got into power, already fully primed with the whole neoliberal package, it really began to let rip. And all the other stuff, the privatisation, the deregulation of the financial sector was absolutely critical. So you have a situation where there's much less public spending, so the poor have to fend much more for themselves. At the same time, there's a deregulation of financial activity. So what do? You start lending money to the poor at extortionate rates of interest. It's a perfect mechanism for extracting vast amounts of money from the pockets of people at the bottom and moving it into the pockets of people at the top, because the net beneficiaries of all credit relations are the top 1% or indeed the top 0.1%. And so there's all these different transfer mechanisms. Another one is the privatization of key public services, such as rail, such as electricity, such as telecoms, and the rest of it, where you can basically put a toll booth in front of that public service and say, in order to survive in this country, to be a citizen, you have to pass through this toll booth and pay me over the odds for the public service, which in many cases like the railways or like energy, I've invested almost nothing in, but I just own. Every time you pass through this gate, you're going to have to pay through the nose to have the privilege of me owning this and you using some of the services which I'm going to let you use. So a tremendously potent source of profit for services which were previously provided by the state, which meant that in aggregate, because the richer people paid more taxes than the poor people, the rich were paying more for those services than the poor. Now, everyone pays an equal amount, but because the poor have far less money, as a proportion of their total income, they're paying far more for those same services. So privatization is incredibly regressive when it comes to those key sectors that you cannot do without, especially sectors which are basically loss-making without massive government support, as almost all of them are. At the same time, the deregulation of rents means that the proprietorial class, the rentier class, those who live from unearned income, which is now the majority of the 1%, or at least the top half of the 1%, the 0.5%, are basically a rentier class. They make their money out of renting property, out of owning essential services, which they invest very little in, and out of financial activity, which is basically another way of extracting rent from the productive activity, the provision of goods and services, which the rest of us are engaged in. And actual rent for your house or your business or whatever it might be, well, this is, of course, a great growth industry, aided yet again by this budget, incidentally, which is reducing capital gains tax to 20%, in other words, half the rate that the rich pay for income tax. You know, if ever you need to know who the favoured class are, the favoured economic class in this country are, just look at the tax rates. The rentiers pay half as much on their money as people who are actually engaged in work pay. So basically the sort of parasitic class, which doesn't actually have to do any work for its money, pays less tax than people who do have to work for their money. What you see as an inevitable result of neoliberalism is the favouring of unearned income, a switch of resources, a transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, and particularly the empowerment and greater enrichment of people who make their money from interest and from rent and from the toll booth economy. And this doctrine has not only massively impoverished us, everyone except those who are in the 1%, by the means I've spelt out, it has, of course, also laid waste to the natural world, because as far as they're concerned, everything is just a market function, and if you can extract money from the natural world, well, you're doing everyone a favour. That's what their doctrine of the invisible hand says. You know, by pursuing your own selfish interests, you are helping the rest of humankind. Well, if that means cutting down a rainforest, destroying a coral reef, poisoning the atmosphere, poisoning the rivers, whatever it might mean, they have to ignore the downside of that. They call them externalities. They don't belong within the economic model, effectively. They're external to that model because, of course, they can't be accommodated within it. So neoliberalism accelerates the destruction of the living world, which admittedly has been at the heart of all ideological projects since the Industrial Revolution. The living world has borne the brunt of just about every ideology there's ever been, but neoliberalism is particularly destructive to it. But it also is destroying our political life. And there is no clearer example of this than Donald Trump. Trump is not a neoliberal. If anything, I mean, the people he comes closest to, the people he most resembles in history, were the proto-fascists or the fascists. But what Trump is appealing to are the people disenfranchised by neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism, like the gold standard before the First World War and its partial reintroduction in some places before the Second World War, what neoliberalism does is apply a straitjacket to politics. It says there is no alternative. I mean, isn't this amazing that this doctrine, which was all about choice and freedom, was promoted with the slogan, "There is no alternative." And the idea is that you lock down the system by this very tight fiscal discipline which neoliberalism demands, so that even when you need to help people, when politics demands that help is available, the money is not there, because the money is being given away to the rich in the form of tax cuts. It's no longer there. Well, actually, it does turn out to be there when you need to bail out the banks. But mysteriously, it just simply wasn't there when anybody else needed a bailout. Neoliberalism says you're locked into this. And because there wasn't anything else available, and for all sorts of other reasons, because of the capture of the entire political class by the plutocrats, as we know, the formerly left parties became entirely sucked into the neoliberal vision, so that both Clinton and Blair were as neoliberal in terms of economic relations as Reagan and Thatcher were. And Blair, was very clearly part of that whole new political project which began in 1979. And so there was this shutdown of choice, there was this belief that the market could solve everything, so you didn't need any political solutions. And what that meant was you had a vast disenfranchised population who saw nothing for them in politics, who just saw it as a stitch-up between rich people. And that is a very, very dangerous situation indeed, because when you have people who do not engage with politics, and you're no longer part of the political world, you have people who are highly susceptible to demagoguery. And what demagoguery does is say, to hell with the rules of politics, to hell with things like debate, and having policies which are, which one side will talk about in this way, and another side in that way, and you say, oh, are you right, are you wrong? To hell with things like facts. It's all about sensation. And if you're appealing to people who are totally shut out of political debate and political engagement, sensation is all that's left. So you run the flag up the pole, you get people saluting to it, you get people chanting and shouting. It's all about the excitement of potential dominance and power and violence, which of course is at the heart of what Trump is offering, is violence, is this great sort of cleansing violence of the kind we saw became a highly attractive message to many people in Europe in the 1930s. And I see that just as the gold standard and similar economic straitjackets in the 1930s, following their own great financial crisis, ensured that there was no political choice, and that in turn provided openings to fascism. I see a very similar thing taking place now. And it's very hard right now in America to see what the way out is going to be, because let's assume, as most people hope, and as indeed, I can't really call it a hope, but I can call it my least worst scenario, is Trump loses and Clinton wins. Let's assume that is the case. Now, Clinton is a straight down the line neoliberal. In fact, even more so, if that's possible, than Bill Clinton was. And she's totally in bed with Wall Street. She hasn't got a progressive bone in her body. She epitomizes the shutdown of political choice and the Bermuda triangulation in which the entire Western world has been lost as the old left, the former left and the right converge on a set of policies which favour the financial sector. So if she gets in, what then happens is the problem that Trump embodies doesn't go away, it gets worse. People see that there's even less hope. At least Obama offered some tiny modifications of the neoliberal agenda, They haven't been nearly as impressive as he promised, and he gave in on just about everything. Clinton offers none of that at all. So then the scenario is that Trump is the John the Baptist. Trump is not the worst we're going to see if that is the case. Someone even nastier comes forward, seeing what Trump has demonstrated, that there is a huge constituency out there who are just completely divorced from rational debate, and so we appeal to them on a totally different level, and thinking that is the path to power. And that is, to me, not an implausible scenario, that things get even worse under Clinton than they are right now. And the danger increases. And this is a direct result of that shutdown. But the other thing, even more potent and perhaps even more dangerous than this, is the extraordinary self-replicating, internalizing capacity that neoliberalism has. It's an astonishing thing, the way that it infiltrates public consciousness so that we all become, in effect, neoliberals. So, we have a system of structural unemployment at the moment. But unemployed people are made to feel it's their fault. If you don't have a job, you're a loser. It's your fault. You've screwed up. You haven't succeeded. You haven't got the right qualifications. You're just not made of the right material. You haven't pulled up your socks. You haven't sorted yourself out. And people come to believe it. Just as the very rich succumb to what I call the self-attribution fallacy, they believe that they are solely responsible for the wealth that they've acquired, despite all the massive advantages they've been given. The very poor also succumb to the self-attribution fallacy. They believe that they're responsible for the terrible situation that they are in. And that's an incredibly effective way in which neoliberalism has begun to affect us. Here's another one. When I tell you that people within the financial sector have acquired wealth beyond all former dreams of wealth, that if they've managed to maneuver themselves into a position where they are senior in a bank in the city, or they are a manager of a formerly publicly owned utility, post-privatization, they just sit back and make millions of pounds every year. On hearing that, is your first response, we've got to sort this system out? Or is your first response, how can I get a piece of that? Because, let's face it, there's a little part in all of us, isn't there now, which thinks, damn it, I chose the wrong profession. And it's a striking feature that, educated people in the 1960s, 1970s, as Tony Judd points out in Ill Fares the Land, educated people, the great majority of graduates would go into some sort of public service or liberal profession. Because being of service, doing good, was considered the highest calling there was. Now the great majority of graduates, particularly from the Russell Group universities, they will go into the professions which pay the most, because that is considered the highest ideal. And we've all internalized that, at least to a small extent. And so we become the shock troops of neoliberalism. And we discipline ourselves, and we kind of discipline other people. And all the ills which it imposes, we blame ourselves for. Debt is another one. Neoliberalism is a fantastic producer of personal indebtedness, for the reasons I've discussed and for many more which are too numerous to go into. But if you're in massive debt, well, you are a failure. You are a loser. You've behaved in a really stupid way. Well, sometimes you have, but in a lot of the cases, you are just one of the many recipients of that policy which has been generalized across the population. And the levels of personal indebtedness are massively higher than they were during the pre-neoliberal era. Obesity. It's another classic example. Obesity is the disease of neoliberalism. You take your kid into the shop, and there are all the sweets and crisps and fizzy drinks at eye level, all in their bright, glossy packaging. You're subject to all this pester power. You succumb. They gradually form this taste for having it every day. And before you know it, you've got an obese child on your hands. And then they are blamed for their obesity. And we now know that obesity is an incredibly difficult thing to row back from because of the metabolic changes that it causes in your body, etc., etc. But you are to blame, and it becomes a whole new frontier of social approbation and social opprobrium, and snobbery. When did you last see your father has turned into when did you last see your feet? And it's a sort of another classic way in which we are all neoliberals now. We internalize these things. But there's another sense in which this belongs to us, in that the political failure, the economic failure, the market failure, the environmental failure, which this represents, belongs to the left just as much as it belongs to the neoliberal right. And that is broadly because, unlike them, we are bereft of a program. The left hasn't had a major idea for 80 years, since Keynes's general theory in 1936. That was the last big idea we had. When you look at what they did, they came up with a wholly new, quite utopian vision in many ways, a wholly new approach at looking at the world. They then found ways of turning it into a language which people readily understood and could accept. They developed this sort of this great network of people who could promote it. They very cleverly started recruiting the media and government advisors and all the rest into it. They developed all these think tanks and things, but they had this solid, core, coherent, deliberate idea. This theory at the heart of it all, which they could just push and push and push. And you know what really distinguished them from the left? They acted in concert. They were a collective. It's one of the great political paradoxes. You know, we on the left go on all the time about we've got to work together, we've got to have collective action. And we're the most individualistic people who ever existed. You know, if someone comes up with a good idea, someone else comes up and says, I've got a better one. And instead of supporting each other and developing our ideas together, we just try to shout each other down. We're riven with jealousy and factional infighting. The politics of envy is not what we direct at the rich, is what we direct to each other. We're a disaster in this respect. And so we have the tyranny of small ideas. We have thousands, often really nice ideas, thousands of little ideas to sort of chip away at the behemoth that we confront. But we have no big idea with which to replace it. And if there's nothing with which to replace it, it doesn't get replaced. That's what we saw after the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. It was crystal clear that we needed a new economic and political system. But there wasn't one on offer. During the Keynesian crisis in the 1970s, the neoliberals, as I say, turned up with the idea on a plate. So here you are. Here's your new idea. What did we do? We said, well, this system doesn't work, does it? Right, there you are. We knew exactly what we didn't like. We had no conception at all of what we wanted to do instead. No conception of an alternative system except a slight modification of the system which had already failed. Or rather, 1,000 slight modifications, many of which competed with each other, of the system which had already failed. And without putting that effort into developing a structural, coherent analysis leading to a structural, coherent, deliberate, central idea with which the system can be replaced, we are wasting our lives. It's all theatrics. You know, theatrics is great. I'm all for the theatre of protest. But the theatre has got to be about a story. You've got to be telling a story, and there's got to be a beginning, a middle, and an end of that story. You've got to know where you are heading towards. The gun hanging on the wall in Act 1 must be used in Act 3, in Ibsen's famous rule. And yet we've got armaments all over the blinking walls and we have no idea what to do with them because of the lack of a central motivating idea. Now, it's very easy for me to say that, of course, and what you're expecting me to say is, and the idea is, but sadly this is about how we got into this mess, not how we get out of the mess. So I'm just as bad as anyone else. But I think there might be something on the horizon, and I've been talking to people who know a lot more about economics than I do, and there is something brewing. That's all I can say at the moment, because I'm under strict instructions not to discuss it, which hopefully by around this time next year, you should be hearing a lot about. I'm really hoping that it turns out to be as good as it appears to be. But it's not my work; it's other people's. But there are high hopes. But maybe that's not the one. But if you do see it, or you do come up with it, well, the key element is we must support each other. We must build it together, rather than trying to knock it down. I mean, this idea of solidarity. Yeah, on the right, they talk about individualism all the time, but they move as a herd. They are tremendously good at solidarity. It's not necessarily a very mindful solidarity. The Tea Party types, the Donald Trump supporters would follow a bucket on a stick. In fact, they follow something even less credible. But they have a real unity of purpose, which is not evident on the left. And so the appeal I'm making is that when the Messiah arises, we recognize that person as the Messiah, in effect. Sorry, this is, I didn't mean to make a religious analogy at all, but you get the general gist that we start looking for that, and even if it's not our idea, we support it as fervently as if it were. And hopefully, as I say, it is in the offing, but we shall see. But the first thing, as the theologian Walter Wink points out, you need to do if you are to confront power is to name it. So the first step, and this is something we can all do right now, is to understand what it is that we confront. And to understand that all the symptoms we see, of all the stuff which is hitting us, like high rents and student debt and the disastrous position that many people find themselves in with either no job or a really crap job which doesn't cover your costs, like the loneliness which many people suffer, like all the public health crises. These are just symptoms. They are not the cause. The cause is a nucleus of coherent thought from which these symptoms arise. And you must recognize that nucleus and recognize that it has a name they gave it. Not a name that we invented, a name which was invented by the originators of it, just as the word communism was invented. This word was invented, and it is neoliberalism. Until we grasp it and understand it and know what we confront, we have no hope of defeating it. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much to George. That was an incredibly powerful, provocative, eloquent, thoroughly depressing view of the times in which we live. I wonder, though, you said that you were diagnosing the mess but not the solution, and in a way you were asking us to wait, to recognize the Messiah, to wait a year. And judging by the people who were tweeting furiously in this audience, I have no doubt that there is ideas in the room that people will want to proffer. So George is available to answer questions from you for the next 20 minutes to 30 minutes or so. So please, could everyone, we have some roving mics. So if we can have a show of hands, please. And I would like as balanced a contribution as possible, I say, looking at all the men raising their hands first, of course. So, okay, yes, we'll start with you then, at the front. Can we?
So thanks for that impassioned dialogue on neoliberalism. I found your story a little bit Euro-America-centric. How can we bring in the rest of the world? Doesn't China matter? Doesn't the Soviet Union, now Russia, matter? Doesn't colonialism matter? It seems to me we need to think about how those elements play into what neoliberalism has become, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Well, this is crucial, of course, and you're quite right. I mean, I talked about it in the British and US context because this is really where the ideas were fomented. But, of course, they have then been spread, and particularly through the World Bank and the IMF with their structural adjustment programs, which were pure neoliberalism, the neoliberalism in its purest form. Basically, you do everything we say. Here's this list. It's going to be privatization, the sell-off of assets at fire sale prices, the removal of capital controls, the destruction of public services, the cutting of taxes, etc., etc. Let foreign capital in and let it do whatever it wants to do. All of that, but then increasingly through trade treaties. They're called trade treaties. Many of them have nothing to do with trade. They have to do with things like intellectual property, so that those who own the intellectual property can screw everybody else, squeeze every drop of money for that intellectual property, Bill Gates take note, in order to maximize their profits. They have things to do with the destruction of the regulations which protect human beings and the living world from predatory capitalism. And the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is one example, but there have already been many of those trade treaties, bilateral treaties in particular, which through this outrageous system of these international tribunals of corporate lawyers who then decide through this investor-state dispute settlement mechanism whether or not the corporation should be allowed just to steal resources from other nations, bypassing the national courts and all the rest of it, impose neoliberalism on those nations to the extent of preventing them from protecting their rainforests from oil exploration, preventing them from protecting their children from cigarette advertising. All of those things which any half-decent civilized government will want to do are actually become banned by the terms of these treaties. So these treaties are the way in which the Washington Consensus, and it is the Washington Consensus, and or rather the Anglosphere Consensus to some extent. It's the US, it's the UK. It was Canada, of course, very much under Harper, and Australia are the classic exponents. Ireland was one until that crashed and burnt. The classic exponents of this neoliberal vision, and they have the means through these trade treaties to impose that on everybody else. Now, China is a very interesting case because China is a great demonstration that the freedoms the neoliberals promised would arise spontaneously from full marketization will liberate people from all forms of oppression. Now, of course, in China, what we see is many aspects of neoliberalism taken almost to their logical absurdity, with basically, you can pollute what you want, you can have all sorts of mafia-like activities which are endorsed by the state and do other people in, but at the same time, it fits very snugly with this highly repressive, tyrannical situation in which there's no political freedom. And so it's a sort of wonderful refutation, in a way, as if any further refutation were required, of the of neoliberal utopianism.
Man in the green jumper, halfway up at the back, please, and then, and then behind as well. And we're looking for more women to ask questions too, please.
Yeah, sorry to be a man.
Don't be so.
Adam Ramsey from Open Democracy. George, I enjoy your talk very much, but I'm slightly sceptical about the idea that neoliberalism is something new, rather than just the form that capitalism took after geographical expansion through colonialism. Mm-hmm. And I'm also sceptical about the idea that the left needs new ideas for the same reason. Surely, if that's what neoliberalism is, it's just another form of capitalism, then the choice is the same as it ever was, as in socialism or barbarism.
Thanks. Well, okay. Thanks, Adam, for that. The first thing I'd say, it is clearly a distinct programme from that of laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century. It's got many aspects in common with laissez-faire capitalism. Basically, we don't care about the poor. We're happy about inequality. We impose fiscal straitjackets. Ricardo's gold standard or Osborne's deficit plan, very similar in those respects. But what laissez-faire capitalism did not envisage was this very activist role of the state in promoting this market system. And what it also did not envisage was the way that it penetrates, the economic program penetrates way beyond economics into every aspect of society and human relations. When Adam Smith of this city talked about the invisible hand, he was talking in a sort of rather metaphorical and quite humorous way about a concept which for him was a very deep one. It was almost nothing to do with what the neoliberals now talk about, this sort of invisible hand sorting out everything for us. It was tied in very well with his theory of moral sentiments, that you are pursuing your interests, but those interests aren't necessarily the interests of selfishness. Like the other Enlightenment philosophers, he was not ennobling and valorizing greed and the profit motive in its own right. For him, self-interest was very often the same as social interest, because your self-interest was served by serving society and by pursuing the higher moral sentiments, by pursuing a cultivated and civilized sense of what it was to be a human being. Neoliberalism is something very different to that. It's seized on that idea of the invisible hand, totally bastardized and bowdlerized it, and then projected it as this mechanism for delivering every sort of social good in a way that Smith never intended and even Ricardo never foresaw. And so I would say it's a really quite distinct philosophy, and that its peculiar self-replicating aspect is also something quite remarkable and quite new in many respects. Now, you say it's socialism or barbarism. Absolutely, but what is that socialism? How do you define that socialism? What is the manifest idea of that socialism? What sits at the heart of it? Is it a Marxist vision? Well, there's several problems with the Marxist vision, not least in that it is perceived correctly as an old vision. And is it a Keynesian vision? Well, there's several problems with the Keynesian vision too. One of them was it ran into enormous difficulties in the 1970s for reasons which haven't gone away. Two is that, like the Marxian vision, it's an old one. And we can no more inspire and energize people with the visions of the 1940s than we can with the visions of the 1840s. But number three, overwhelmingly and far bigger than that, and this is also a problem for Marxism, Keynes has absolutely nothing to say about the environmental crisis, which is the biggest crisis by far that we confront. The Keynesian fiscal stimulus accelerates the environmental crisis. Under the Keynesian vision, just as under the neoliberal vision, salvation is indistinguishable from catastrophe. Because everything that is good economically is bad environmentally, because you are stimulating economic growth, which is the fundamental driver of environmental destruction. So, socialism is a very convenient term in that respect if you don't define it. In fact, just like neoliberalism or just like the market, it hides more than it elucidates. What socialism? Which socialism? What is the character of this socialism? How is it to be implemented? I'm not saying we need an alternative to left-wing politics, we need a new left-wing politics. Call it a new socialism if you like, but we can't go back to the old ones. They are not going to deliver, and just as importantly, they are not going to inspire.
Further questions? Okay, I'm going to go to this side of the room, right up at the back, please, and then we'll come down to the front.
Thank you, George. Your comments on neoliberalism are very, very well targeted, but I do fear that are you not simply, when you say how well organised they were and how effective they were, I think you're just describing that they've won for the time being. And obviously, you know, when you've lost the argument or you're in the process of losing it, as the left has, you look disorganised and your opponents look organised. So I think you're sort of doing us a disservice by exaggerating the effectiveness and the coherence of that side of the argument. But also, to be quite frank, I think you're doing us a disservice by saying we don't have the ideas available to tackle it. And just at the very sort of most simplest version of that is, how about not doing that stuff? I.e., if it was that bad, then we do have all sorts of ideas about not doing what they've done. But also, I simply need to assert, just as you've asserted the opposite, that it is perfectly possible to integrate a conception of a new economy which does respect the environment within either a Marxist or a Keynesian framework, precisely because the essence of those frameworks is that we control what our economy does for us. I agree we have to work it through, but I don't think, frankly, in an audience of this size, which we need to mobilise for the movement which will change this, to say we don't have the ideas available to tackle this is helpful to those of us who are trying to build that movement.
Thank you. Well, to be brutally honest, I'm not trying to be helpful at this stage. I'm trying to be clear. And I believe in being clear that eventually translates into being helpful, but that's not the immediate purpose. The immediate purpose is to try to develop a clear understanding of where we stand. Because actually, our efforts are vitiated and wasted if we don't have that understanding to begin with. And we cannot build a helpful vision, a useful vision, unless we know exactly what we're building from and the position we're in to begin with. And again, what I would say is not doing the bad stuff presupposes that you are doing something. Just not doing stuff is not a political vision. And it means that there must be an alternative to the bad stuff. You've got to have a different economic program. You cannot not have an economic program. You cannot not have an economic vision any more than you can not have a political vision and hope to get anywhere at all. And the problem with Blair or Brown or Miliband is they didn't have either an economic or a political vision. They just had triangulation. They just had a way of surviving. And Brown or Miliband, in their better moments, might have said, well, we're trying not to do the bad stuff. But actually, they were still doing the bad stuff because the bad stuff was woven into the warp and weft of their entire vision and their worldview, simply because they didn't have an alternative vision. They didn't have another way of looking at it. And again, what I would respectfully say is that you have restated the problem, you have not answered it. You've said, well, so we've got the Marxists and the Keynesian visions which, are about taking control of the economy. Fine. But if the Marxist vision in itself, or the Keynesian vision in itself, cannot sufficiently take control of the economy in the way that will deliver for us and the way it will work, particularly for the environmental crisis, it has to be a different version of taking control of the economy. And the question is, what is that version? Now, on the first part of your question, with regard to the organisation of this network, of course, it's very easy to backcast and history of the propaganda of the victors and all the rest of it. But remember, in this case, it's not the victors who are doing the propagandising. They're keeping quiet about it. They're not putting up the banners and saying, it's like communist-style banners with neoliberals with their fists raised and holding their scythes in their left hands. That you're not seeing any of that at all. They don't even have a name. When you say, okay, you don't like the name neoliberalism because they don't, you say, what would you call it instead? You say, well, it's just a kind of classical liberalism, which it plainly is not. or it's liberalism. That's another thing they call it. Well, what the hell does liberalism mean in this day and age? They don't have a name for it. They don't want to have a name for it. They are not proclaiming it. So it relies on others, on historians and politically active people on the left to look at it and say, well, what is this thing and where did it come from? And only quite recently has its extraordinary organising abilities begun to come to light through the work of people like Daniel Stedman Jones and Will Davis and people like that who have very painstakingly pieced the story together. Philip Mirovsky has been key to this as well, and gradually sort of look back and say, oh my God, they were organising on a phenomenal scale. This Mont Pelerin Society, which was founded by Friedrich Hayek in 1947, was quite astonishing what it did, but it did it under the radar. It involved a great deal of people, very large numbers of people. It was multidisciplinary. It involved a whole lot of people who became extremely politically powerful later on, but it did it quietly. And when you look at the extraordinary level of organisation they had, I see nothing like that today on the left. And that is one of the things that I believe we are lacking. And look, let me say, I'm wholly and horribly aware of how inadequate what I've been saying today is, because I have not got the answer for you. I do not know the answers, and I sort of get this vague thing about the Messiah will come next year. Well, she may not, but what I'm trying to do here, instead of sort of helpfully suggesting what the alternative is to suggest the method by which the alternative is identified, promoted, and made viable. When we see that we might already exist somewhere, but we're not hearing about it, when we see what that is. But there has to be a coherent and deliberate alternative. Not doing bad stuff is not enough. There has to be a clear political vision, which again can be served up on a plate when the next crisis hits, and it won't be long.
Lady at the front.
Thanks, George. I was interested that Hillary Clinton is your least worst possibility, and whether you didn't mention Bernie Sanders because you don't think he would win the nomination, or you think that if he did, that Trump would get in. But more generally, because I'm always looking for reasons for hope in a disastrous world, I'm interested in whether you think when things get to the bottom that can be very useful because it creates such a situation of desperation that it might actually make things possible that weren't originally thought possible, or whether actually you think that going down to the depths of things like Trump becoming president would actually take us into situations where loads of possibilities are cut off. So, for example, I'm wondering, if you think Clinton will make the situation worse, would it actually be better to get Trump for 4 years and see just how dreadful it is, and if we survive and he doesn't press the nuclear button? I've sometimes wondered, for example, whether it would be useful for UKIP to get a bit of power, because they seem often so thick, to be polite, that that would be exposed. But then I think to myself, but actually, we've seen already how Maggie Thatcher brought everything. Everybody is now further right in the UK because of her. So, are things closed off? What's your view?
Thank you. No, a very pertinent question. First of all, the only reason why I don't think why Bernie Sanders was not my choice of the least worst candidate is that I think after yesterday he's probably out of the race, sadly, because he had a lot more to offer. And the potential, at any rate, to basically divert the growing proto-fascist movement which seems to be developing in the United States by giving people a genuine political alternative. Now, on the wider question, the research of the Common Cause Foundation, which is a very interesting bunch of people, among the many fascinating things they show is how we normalise and internalise the values that are projected to us from the sources of power. And Mrs. Thatcher understood this very well. Economics is the method. What was it again? God, someone help me with this. The object is thank you, Adam. I knew I could rely on you. The object is to change a soul. And she did. She was extremely effective at that by just recasting our identity, basically saying, "You are this kind of person. You are competitors. You operate within a market system, and you've got to be one of the winners. In fact, you have it in you to be one of the winners. And those people, the other, they are the losers. And we don't want to be like that. We're going to give you the right to buy, so you're going to be one of the winners. You tell Sid to buy some shares so you can be one of the winners. And you internalise that, you absorb that. And your identity changes as a result. And what was outrageous before soon becomes normal. Most people in any society side with the status quo, whatever it happens to be. Totalitarian communism, totalitarian Nazism, social democracy, neoliberalism. We absorb it and we side with it. We become that thing. You know, Nixon said, we are all Keynesians now. Blair could very easily have said we're all neoliberals now. He never used the word, as far as I'm aware, but it would have been a true sentiment. And so this idea of this sort of the purging of politics by having a Donald Trump in to just show how bad it is simply not how it works. People, incidentally, said the same about Hitler. They said, let this buffoon get in. Yeah, and then people will see what a great idea social democracy is. And of course, buffoons are extremely dangerous, because what buffoons in politics do, clever buffoons, Hitler was a clever buffoon, Mussolini was a clever buffoon, Trump is a clever buffoon, what they do is to say, to hell with all that polite, boring politics stuff. And, this is about you, the great people, marching together under one banner, dominating other sectors of society. We are the winners, they are the losers, everything else is irrelevant. And you just have these very potent symbols which you flash up, and the military music, and the stomping of boots, and the ringing of shouts, and that's all you need. And it works on the human brain like an infection. And so no good comes of it. Really no good at all. Do not wish for these things.
We've probably got time for about 2 more questions. Question here, and then we'll go to the lady up halfway up. Sorry, right beside you. Right where you were sitting. I was trying to make it easier.
Hi. So here's a big idea that is out there on the left and is being talked about, which is basic income. So there's lots of people living in poverty. They don't deserve to be there. There's lots of people enjoying phenomenal amounts of wealth. Let's redistribute that money. Let's make the economy a voluntary exercise for the whole of human history. People are being forced into it. Let's make it voluntary. Let's give everybody a living wage, whether they do paid work, or whether they contribute in other ways.
Thank you. Well, look, first I'll say I'm very much in favour of basic income. I think it's a great idea, a really great idea, but it's more of policy than an idea. It's a second-order idea. It's something you do, something you implement, a lovely thing which ought to be done, absolutely. It is not in itself a philosophy. It can arise from a philosophy, but what you need is a philosophical framework from which it arises. And then you say, as part of this philosophy, and it automatically arises from this philosophy, here is basic income. And it's got to be this distinct and discrete philosophical framework. That's what we saw with Marx. That's what we saw with Keynes. That's what we saw with Hayek. They all had something entirely new to offer from which their favoured policies then flowed. Now, I know there are organisations like the Green Party, though it's, it didn't get into the manifesto in England, at any rate, I don't know about in Scotland, before the last election, that basic income would be part of it. And Greens have a philosophy, but it's not a philosophy which is immediately identifiable as something completely different from the left philosophies that have gone before. It's got lots of the potential elements of it. It doesn't have what I see as that binding, unifying theme running through it, where you say, hey, this is something totally unlike what I've seen, totally unlike the system we currently have or the systems we have had in the past. And from then, yes, absolutely, the second order stuff, like basic income, can be a wonderful aspect of it. But the problem we have at the moment, and this is what I mean by the tyranny of small solutions, is we have loads and loads of second order ideas, loads of them, but they don't currently cohere in a way that is comprehensible to most people. If you were to try to describe the philosophy from which basic income arises, it would take quite a long time to describe it. But neoliberalism, you can say, is basically market relations in every aspect of life. It's very, very easy to describe. That is the kind of thing that we are missing.
Okay, lady has to be up.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I'd like to hear what you think about us in Scotland, I suppose, because a lot of what you say is, when I reflect on it, we've experienced a massive political engagement, particularly obviously the referendum, and we're running up to an election in May, which the S&P are forecasted to win in the same ways that they did in the previous election. And obviously, what's happened here is that people have engaged in different ways, and we do have a slightly different narrative, but how different is that? And what's your thoughts on that in terms of both the support for the SNP, the sort of discussion around the referendum, but also the future really, and why is it that there has been such a big move towards the SNP? Obviously, there's discussions about Scottish Labour, but what's happening there, and is that just a kind of desperation to grab onto, or what are your thoughts on that, really?
I see what's happening in Scotland as extremely exciting, and the buzz that I pick up every time I come here is thrilling to someone who lives in a country which is politically dead. I mean, Britain, if you look at it on the map, it is dead from the neck down. Currently, Wales just makes me despair right now. There is so much potential, and it, in my view, it's just being frittered away right now. But anyway, we won't get on to Wales. I think I might have been the only English journalist in a mainstream newspaper to come out in favour of independence. So correct me if I'm wrong. And one of the reasons for that, not just because I thought it was a brilliant idea in its own right, but also because for the first time in a long time in Britain, a genuine, meaningful choice was being offered to people. And the potential to galvanise people and to bring back into politics the people who have been disenfranchised. I could see that as being tremendously exciting. And boy, did it ever happen. I mean, seeing those queues of people registering to vote right up until midnight was one of the most exciting things I've ever witnessed in Britain. I mean, that was thrilling. People who were completely shut out of the political system becoming re-engaged with it. So it's a tremendously hopeful sign. And of course, that is the great antidote to demagoguery. And to the sort of cheap populism in which Trump engages, is the re-engagement of people. But in order to have that re-engagement, you need genuine political choices to put before people. And the great thing about the referendum was it was a genuine and meaningful political choice, unlike just about everything that had preceded it over the past 10 years, 15 years, where we just had not had any real political choices put in front of us. And we see the results of that. Now, it's not at the end of the matter, of course, and it's very exciting to see how that political momentum appears to have been sustained, even though independence didn't happen that time. But it's an indication to me of the great power of real alternatives. If you can put forward a very coherent alternative and give people a very clear choice of meaningful politics, and I'm not talking about a choice between a lunatic demagogue and neoliberalism, but a choice of clearly articulated, meaningful politics, which people who are alienated from politics can immediately grasp and understand and see the relevance to themselves, then you re-engage people and you bring them back. Now, Scotland at the moment has got a lot more potential to do this than England has. And if there is hope, it lies in Scotland. The breeding ground of much of the Enlightenment could be the breeding ground of the 21st century Enlightenment. Who knows?
Because there isn't alternatives coming out. Actually, you know what I mean? The SNP doesn't necessarily present.
Oh no, I'm not suggesting they do for a moment. I mean, the great alternative that was presented was the possibility of independence. But the SNP, its variations, it's a softening of the neoliberal model by comparison to what we've seen elsewhere, but it's still broadly within that model. It's like they're not doing as much bad stuff. But where is the clear and distinct political vision, in my view, it's not there. But I'm saying that because Scotland is re-engaging to the extent it is, and because there are so many interesting people doing interesting stuff here, there is a breeding ground for ideas.
And on that note, much as I would be delighted to carry on that particular conversation, I think we will have to leave it. The very important workers who look after this building need to get home, and so we have to try and leave rapidly now so they can do that. On behalf of the university and the School of Social and Political Science, I would like us to thank George. I'm sure we will be hearing much more from George on the ideas and some of the radical thoughts and the coherent thoughts that you are so looking for. I hope that conversation is an inclusive one in a university, and having participated in that big public debate that we have been going through the last few years, it's clear that it's not just the intellectuals that have the source of those ideas. It may be small ideas, there may be a tyranny of small ideas out there, but there are genuine things that people have to offer. So I hope that's a participative process. But if you can join me, please, in thanking George in the usual way for a thoroughly entertaining talk.
I just remind you that the book is available for sale down in the foyer, and George will be down shortly signing. And don't forget about making a wee donation if you want to. And see you in Word Power.